Women represent roughly 50% of the world's population, yet many don't have equal rights, even in this day and age. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Reports show that women make up roughly 60% of the world's working poor, and many work in exploitative conditions in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. A recent report shows women in poor countries would be $9 trillion better off if they were paid the same as their male counterparts. The United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said equality for women would be progress for all. But why is the status of women still not better around the world, and what can be done about it? To discuss the subject, I'm joined by Ann Oberhauser, a professor who specializes in gender and globalization. She's worked with women in the workplace in sub-Saharan Africa. She joins us from West Virginia. And here with me on the set is Nii Akuetteh, a former executive director of Africa Action. He has extensive experience in various parts of Africa, helping communities become self-reliant and socially and economically prosperous. Thanks to both of you for joining us. And let me start with you. Here we are in the 21st century, and there still remains a significant gap between the genders, between male and female, especially when it comes to things like access to employment and education. Why is that?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to the forum this afternoon, because this is an extremely important topic and one that I'm very passionate about and been studying for pretty much all of my career. Yes, indeed, we are in the 21st century. There continue to be these great inequities, and in a variety of different areas of society. And I think one of the fundamental barriers that women have in terms of access and equal opportunity are some of the ways that masculinity, femininity, and ideas about men and women's roles in society are constructed. And if we look at, for instance, in the workplace and the value that's placed on women's labor, whether it be in the types of jobs that they hold or the pay that they have or the security that they have, these are all areas that could definitely benefit from more of an equal approach and an equal opportunities. One of the other issues that continues to plague women's status and affect their self-confidence and their growth and prosperity is gender-based violence. And that's a continuing area and problem throughout the world, where women are victims of assault, of rape, of domestic violence, and other areas which really kind of prevent them from moving ahead. And we're trying to mobilize and bring more attention to those type problems throughout the world.
Nii, we talked about what the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, and he said the evidence is clear: equality for women means progress for all. Is there a failure to recognize that in the world today?
I think there is a failure. It seems to me that you've got this divide where men would look at, they look outside their own families and their spouses. But if they look inside their families, their mothers, their sisters, their children, it seems to me they are more open to the idea. But I think it's a matter of just raising men's consciousness. And of course, raising the consciousness of policymakers, which just so happens to be overwhelmingly men.
And you raised an important point just a moment ago when you talked about the violence against women. Do you find that in many instances that violence against women is more prevalent in developing societies rather than in developed societies, for the simple reason that women in developed societies, to a large extent, do have recourse to justice, whereas in many instances in the developing world, they don't?
Well, I think that's somewhat of a myth, that in the developed world, there's less violence towards women. We still, even in our communities, among our neighbors, with our colleagues and our coworkers, face instances where women are subject to domestic violence, to rape, to sexual assault, and other forms of kind of physical and gender-based violence and oppression. So, and this cuts across class as well, and that's another misnomer or myth about gender-based violence, is it's maybe just poor women, for example, who are subject to this, when people of all different, women of all different classes face violence and domestic abuse. So that's something that women across the world face, and oftentimes, women in developing countries are seen as victims or more subject to this type of violence, when indeed it really is across. Just one other thing I'd like to mention regarding some of these violence is the human trafficking issue, and that, as we're reading more about in the media, and hearing more about, is a prominent problem, again, across the world. And for instance, here in West Virginia, we're facing instances of human trafficking, some of whom are women entering into prostitution, having forced entry into prostitution and sex slavery or some of these other issues. But again, human trafficking, same as gender-based violence, cuts across all different geographic areas.
And I want to ask you about some specific problems when it comes to the gender gap, and that is you worked extensively in sub-Saharan Africa. And we know that in sub-Saharan Africa, much of the hard labor that is carried out on farms, say in sub-Saharan Africa, carried out by women. Women who not only have to go out and do these jobs every day, but they also have to bring up a family at the same time. What are some of the conditions that you found in your work?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Here at West Virginia University, I work in the geography program in the Department of Geology and Geography. And we combine both kind of a natural resource and a physical geography with a human and cultural geography perspective. So some of the work that I have done for over 20 years in Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Malawi, etc., concerns or kind of focuses on rural development issues. And just as you indicated, women are very much involved in agriculture. There are gender roles, so women, for example, are more responsible for collecting water, collecting fuel wood, some of the kind of specific agricultural tasks, but nonetheless, they're extremely involved. So they're much closer to and aware of environmental issues than men, for example. And these are areas that need more attention. And in discussions even of climate change, understanding some of these gender roles and women's contribution to the whole agricultural and farming process can help immensely in trying to deal and mitigate some of the impacts of climate change.
Nii, what has been your experience of working with people in African societies? I mean, as I pointed out, it's one thing to go out for women to go and work on these farms, and then they have the burden of actually being the main caregivers to children and other relatives in the family as well.
I think that is so true. It might interest you to note, when I got the invitation yesterday, I talked to several of my women friends, Africans here and on the continent, and they brought up the issue of doing work outside the home, and then whether it's working on the farm, whether it's being in the informal sector, running mom and pop businesses, or even being in the formal sector these days. When they come home, they have to do the domestic work too, of taking care of children and family and cooking. And all of them said, we are pushing to get men to take up the burden inside the home as well.
And looking at some of the economic issues that this gender gap poses, there's a report by ActionAid which shows that women in poor countries would be, as we mentioned earlier, $9 trillion better off if their pay and access to work were the same as that of men. I mean, there's also a failure to recognize that. It would be better, I would imagine, for the world economy as a whole.
Yes, absolutely. There's some interesting work being done in the economic and development sphere on trying to value women's work more. So that, for example, in looking at the pay gap, as you mentioned, in looking at some of these other inequalities, if women were in the same status or were held at the same level of men's work and of different occupations, that their lives would certainly be better off, families would certainly be better off, and oftentimes women provide those role models for the younger generation. So I think it's only a win-win situation, as the UN Secretary General stated, is that advancing women in society certainly advances everybody and lifts everybody up. I would also like to note that in looking at long-term economic and financial security, it's very important, because women live longer, after all, than men on average, that we look at kind of a whole lifetime and across the life cycle, the importance of valuing and paying women equally within their when they're in their careers and in their income-generating years, that will carry them through to old age as well. So it's a lifetime investment and impacts of some of these inequities.
Nii, there is also this practice in many countries in Africa of engaging in migrant labor, where men leave their homes in the rural areas, they go to the cities and they work there, and they only see their spouses, they only see their children, other members of their family, sometimes only once a year. And I'm wondering what kind of impact that has on women in rural areas.
Well, the impact is not, is mostly problematic, because when you know, one spouse is away and the other spouse carries the entire burden, it's a problem. On the other hand, I mean, because we may have to pick up so many of the roles of both parents, you could say that you see instances in where they are practicing skills on both sides of this parenting issue. Of course, when the men return, or when they are reconnected with their families, it does raise issues of misunderstanding leading to gender violence that the professor mentioned. I was thinking, though, that, you know, at some point we have to start looking for workable models. What works in terms of pay equity and things like that. You know, across West Africa, you've got the issue of market women. Because of colonialism, they went into business, not for the government, and a lot of them are economically independent. And then in some West African countries, actually, government policy is such that, when I talked with my friends yesterday, I was astounded. 5 of them, all of them said, you know, pay inequity in government jobs in West Africa is not an issue, because the law says if you are qualified, everybody gets paid the same, and a lot of West African women are running businesses of their own.
And while researching the subject, I came across an interesting fact. It was a bit astounding, actually, that out of 143 economies, 90% were found to have at least one law that restricts economic equality for women. How long is it going to be before that changes?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's somewhat discouraging when you know, decade after decade, we're asking the same questions and facing some of the same barriers to advancement. And I would like to add, actually, I've done extensive work in South Africa. And following the apartheid regime, and I know my colleague referred to the whole colonial legacy, and that's certainly important when you're understanding and looking at some of the disparities and inequities in these countries. So that's an excellent point. But South Africa, going back to kind of South Africa, and of course it has a whole apartheid legacy that it's dealing with as well. But it's important in looking at a post-apartheid society is the Constitution, when it was written, is extremely progressive. It's one of the more progressive constitutions in the world, in which there's so many issues and laws put in place to require gender equity and racial equity and a lot of these other issues. So there are some really good examples of progressive constitutions where gender equity is built into that we can learn from. And, you know, unfortunately, there are despots and there are some pretty, you know, bad examples of good leadership in some countries in Africa. And there needs to be more pressure from all over, from the West, from other southern states, from African states. There needs to be more pressure put on these governments that haven't changed to come about and, you know, make things work that's fair for all of their population.
Ann, thanks so much for being with us. Nii Akuetteh, thanks for being with us as well. We are going to have to take a short break right now. When we come back, we'll take an in-depth look at women in the United States and what issues they face, especially in the workplace. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.